Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories of this hour. The US and Iran agree to hold talks in Oman on Friday, despite sharp differences over the scope of negotiations. Washington seeks to include Iran's missile program, while Tehran says only its nuclear file is on the table. Envoys from Russia and Ukraine meet in Abu Dhabi for US-brokered talks on ending the war. The meeting comes as a Russian cluster munitions attack killed 7 people at a market in Ukraine. Trump says China is considering boosting purchases of US soybeans after what he calls positive talks with Xi Jinping. Beijing may raise buying to 20 million tons, even as it warns Washington over arms to Taiwan. Taiwan says the Trump-Xi phone call will help stabilize regional security amid rising Chinese military pressure. Beijing calls for mutual respect with Washington in talks going forward. New York City joins the World Health Organization's Global Outbreak Response Network after Trump withdraws the US from the agency. The move by Democratic leaders defies the president and seeks to maintain global health cooperation. The UN chief calls the expiry of the New START treaty a grave moment for global peace and security. He urges the US and Russia to quickly negotiate a new nuclear arms control framework. Donald Trump endorses conservative prosecutor Clay Fuller in a Georgia special election to replace Marjorie Taylor Greene. Trump calls Fuller an America First patriot and a strong supporter of his MAGA agenda. Ukraine's energy minister warns power cuts could intensify in the coming days. He says Russia may launch new air attacks on power and heating networks in the country. Those are the headlines for the hour. We start with the ongoing conflict in Eastern Europe. And Ukraine and Russia have entered the second day of US-brokered talks in Abu Dhabi. The top Ukrainian negotiator, Rustem Urumov, confirmed the continuation of the discussions on the Telegram app. According to Urumov, the same formats as yesterday are in place with trilateral consultations and group work to align positions. Russian envoy Dmitriev has called the Russia-US meetings in Abu Dhabi positive, saying there's progress towards a peace deal. Despite pressure from the EU and UK, Dmitriev noted active efforts are underway to restore Russia-US relations. Let's listen into his statements.
Ну, как вы знаете, совместно с администрацией президента Трампа идет активная работа по восстановлению отношений Россия-США по экономическому направлению, вот в том числе в рамках российско-американской группы по экономическому сотрудничеству. И мы в том числе встречались сегодня, и встречи идут позитивно.
Сергей Александрович, а есть ли прогресс по мирному соглашению?
Вы знаете, здесь неким индикатором может быть то, что вот разжигатели войны из Европы, из Британии постоянно пытаются помешать этому процессу, постоянно пытаются в него влезть. И вот чем больше таких попыток происходит, тем больше мы видим, что, безусловно, прогресс есть и идет хорошее позитивное движение вперед.
Но здесь в Абу-Даби помешать невозможно, я полагаю.
Ну, им сложно, но они стараются.
Meanwhile, Ukraine's deputy prime minister says Russia attacked railway infrastructure in Ukraine's Sumy region overnight. Joining us now is Professor Veselin Popovsky, a professor and vice dean at Jindal Global Law School, joining us live from New Delhi. Thank you very much, Professor Popovsky, for joining us. As always, it is a great pleasure. The second day of negotiations, trilateral negotiations, is underway now in Abu Dhabi between the US, Ukraine and Russia. Judging on how the first day went, we know little, but do you have any hopes for the second?
Yes, I do. And every negotiations carries some hopes. although minimal as they are, it's better to talk and to have this channel of correspondence and communications rather than to have a complete silence. But again and again, we see misunderstanding. What just Dmitriev said in your video just a minute ago was that it is the Western country that fueled the war in Ukraine, and somehow Russia is trying to achieve peace, it's trying to negotiate peace, it's trying to improve the economic relations between United States and Russia. Everything that Dmitriev says is a big lie, and it's a manipulation. It's not like the Western countries started this war, and they are not the ones that continued this war. In fact, they did not. They didn't help Ukraine in the first place enough as to stop the war. So to accuse the Western country, the British and the French here, is absolutely irrelevant. So effectively what Russia tries to achieve in these negotiations and to show that they are willing, but they are not willing, they're just making a pretending that they are willing, and somehow to keep United States as a trading partner. They are interested to trade with the United States. And obviously they try to seduce Donald Trump in some economic and financial matters, and somehow to bribe Donald Trump as offering him some concessions, some access to Siberian mineral and resources and everything else, as to keep Trump engaged with Russia so that Trump does not impose economic sanctions on Russia. So that's the game of Russia here. They pretend they are negotiating with Ukraine only to have a partner like United States for their other deals. Somehow they are telling even Donald Trump, forget Ukraine, we will sort that out very quickly, push them to go out of Donbass. We are happy to sign the peace. But in the meantime, let's go to important matters, the Arctic Sea, the minerals, the resources. We have much bigger business, Russians are telling United States, than Ukraine, which effectively Donald Trump is very easily seduced into such conversations.
And Professor, these statements calling the EU and UK warmongers, of course, does that mean that Europe won't have a seat at the table at any time soon in these talks? And does that matter since Ukraine does?
Well, Europe will have a seat. It's not for Russia to say that. Ukraine and Europe behind Ukraine will always be there. There is no deal between Russia and United States whatsoever, and the attempt to do that failed immediately after the meeting in Alaska. So Russia and United States cannot decide anything without Europe, and even Donald Trump realizes that. He listens to the British Prime Minister, to the French President, to the German Chancellor all the time. He understands that without the Europeans, nothing can be achieved in Ukraine, and Ukraine will not surrender its territory in Donbass exactly because it has the strong European support. So Russian plan here is going nowhere, because Europe will be, if not on the table, it will be behind Ukraine, which will be always on the table.
Professor, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. It's always a great pleasure to talk to you on these issues. We move on now, and China's foreign ministry has called on the US to make a proactive response and resume dialogue with Russia on strategic stability. China regretted the expiration of the New START treaty and urged both countries to restart talks to maintain nuclear stability. The ministry also stressed the importance of continued dialogue to avoid deteriorating relations and to ensure global security. This comes after the treaty between the US and Russia expired, leaving the future of arms control uncertain. Joining us now to discuss this is Dr. Asta Chadha, an Associate Professor of International Relations at Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, Japan. Thank you very much, Dr. Chadha. As always, it is a great pleasure. This marks decades. For the first time, there has been no form of treaty which enforces nuclear stability between these two great nuclear powers. The United States has said that China should be involved in these negotiations. Why is China urging the US to resume these strategic stability talks with Russia now, while declining to be involved in it itself?
Well, wonderful at my end also to be here on your platform, Thomas. I mean, let's understand what was happening with this treaty. I mean, did this treaty just recently expire? That's true, as you stated, but it had been in a way suspended since Russia's war in Ukraine. So effectively, it was still not functional. There were always, there was a fear, let's say, amongst Europe and its allies in the United States and the rest of the world that Russia could anytime ramp up its nuclear arsenal because it had clearly suspended the treaty. Now, given that it is even legally suspended, it calls into question as to what is going to happen with the freeze on the number of, ICBMs or freeze on the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads in the world. Now, why did US want China involved? The US wanted China there because China is undeniably, a rising global power. And they wanted China also to be part of this treaty so as to limit China's capabilities with regard to nuclear warheads, with regard to deployment of delivery systems, submarines, bombers, so on and so forth. Was China keen on being part of the treaty? Absolutely not. China never wanted to be part of this treaty because, again, it does not want to put a cap or a legal cap on its own numbers in some way. But then comes the question, why is China concerned? I mean, my reading of this thing is that China is trying to appear both on one hand as a very responsible global power. It consistently, in the past also, China has been calling out United States as a hegemonic power, that tries to serve unilateral decisions in the rest of the world. And under Trump presidency, it has become even more evident that China has called United States' position out several times. So by stating that we need urgently a treaty of the sort between US and Russia, China is trying to argue that, both these countries cannot be allowed to have an unconstrained or unrestrained sort of, access to or deployment of nuclear warheads. But on the other hand, it is also trying to in some way limit or create a sort of a strategic stability in the system, because what this leads to is if there is no legal cap and if there's had been a suspension since 2023 by Russia of this treaty, what it essentially leads to is more anxiety in the international system, wherein it pushes forth an arms race of sorts. So is Chinese arsenal as big as that of United States and Russia? No, it's way smaller than that, but it will push eventually China also in this nuclear arms race to build up its own capabilities. So I think for those reasons, China is trying to appear as, a global power that's more concerned, as well as a global power that's more responsible.
Do you think China's statement is a warning that great power competition is eroding the last guardrails of global security here?
I mean, in a way, yes. Of course, China is going to aim at it because let's not forget, I mean, what is the current arsenal when we talk about US and Russia, close to 5,000 each or something like that, and Chinese is way lesser than that. So yes, in one way, a legal suspension or a legal, let's say, ineffectiveness of a treaty of that sort does lead to great power competition. I mean, in that China is not wrong, but we must also understand China is part of the great power competition. So when it calls out for a renegotiation of this treaty in some way, China must also step in and be part of the same treaty to avoid the very trap that it's calling Russia and US on.
Do you think restarting talks would be seen as rewarding Russia despite the ongoing conflict in Ukraine?
I mean, yes, in a strategic sense it would, but then again, let's not forget, who are the allies who could potentially stand up against Russia and China power combined? Because let's not forget, ever since this conflict in Ukraine happened, China and Russia are not only ramping up their bilateral partnership, their defense treaties, but also they are sharing a lot of common platforms for cooperation. I mean, they are together on SCO, they are together on BRICS, they are together usually on the UN Security Council. So they have already kind of, in a way, they've created this interdependent defense cooperation already. So which are the other powers that could effectively stand up to that combined power of China and Russia, which is the United States? And how many US allies are nuclear capable? I mean, let's not forget, there are wider implications of this in the region, for European security, for Asian security. Countries like South Korea and Japan heavily depend on US nuclear umbrella. So on one hand, yes, I mean, it might appear that it could strengthen Russia's position because, they might take the step ahead in some way trying to renegotiate it, or China might appear stronger, diplomatically in trying to intervene and renegotiate this treaty. But eventually this is meant to stabilize this sort of an arms race in the international system, and it is, I think in some way it's necessary that all these global powers do exercise restraint.
And what are your thoughts on how the Trump administration has gone forward with this, shall I say, lack of going forward with this? And do you see the administration even addressing the issue?
I mean, it's very unfortunate that at the moment I do not see a lot of enthusiasm, either on the Russian side or on the American side, to renegotiate this or in some way try and find an alternative framework that does bring stability into the system. On the contrary, most of the decisions that are coming out of these global powers or revisionist powers, or however you might want to label them, they are all in some way feeding more anxiety into the international system, and you can bring in other powers like China also into the equation. So with regard to whether or not, I mean, this treaty cannot really be renewed in the same way, right? It has to be renegotiated, taking into account the newer realities of the international system. So are we only talking about a US-Russia renegotiation? Are other countries willing to come on board and then exercise a collective restraint in some way? It seems unfortunately a bit far-fetched at the moment, because I do not see any such enthusiasm.
Dr. Chadha, do stay with us as we turn over to our next story. And Australian authorities say that they are treating an attempt to bomb a rally protesting against the country's National Day on January the 26th as a terrorism incident. A 31-year-old man was arrested after allegedly hurling a homemade bomb into a crowd of several thousand people in Perth on January the 26th, and the bomb failed to detonate and no one was injured in the incident. The terror charge is the first time the offence has been levelled in the state of Western Australia and carries a maximum sentence of life in prison. Police and Western Australia Premier Roger Cook says that the man held white supremacist views and the attack was an attempt to target Australia's Aboriginal people, one of the country's two main Indigenous groups. Let's listen in to what the Western Australian Premier had to say.
Last Monday, on January the 26th, a man allegedly threw a homemade bomb into a crowd of people peacefully protesting in the heart of Perth City. Thankfully, it did not detonate. But for that, we could have seen a mass casualty event with injuries and potential loss of life. This charge, which has been laid by the Joint Task Force, alleges the attack on Aboriginal people and other peaceful protesters was motivated by hateful, racist ideology.
Now we move on to some more news from Australia, and a statue of Mahatma Gandhi has been stolen in the Australian city of Melbourne, sparking outrage among the local Indian community and political leaders. The statue, located in a public park and symbolising Gandhi's message of peace and non-violence, was found missing earlier this week. Police say they are investigating the incident and reviewing CCTV footage from the surrounding area to identify those responsible. Community groups have condemned the theft, calling it a disrespectful act against a global icon revered for his role in India's independence and his advocacy of non-violent resistance. Authorities say efforts are underway to recover the statue and secure the site to prevent further incidents. Dr. Chadha joins us once again in just a minute. Dr. Chadha, thank you very much. Of course, this follows a flurry of events. Both of these incidents follow, of course, that devastating shooting on Bondi Beach in Sydney. We've seen multiple attacks that have, and minority driven violence in Australia over the recent few months. What does this say about the mood of the country right now, and how tense it is, and about multicultural harmony in the country of Australia?
Absolutely. I mean, very sorry state of affairs that, a country like Australia that has maintained significant amount of law and order for a very long time is now under extreme pressure from these extremist groups, whether they are religious extremist groups or ingrown extremist groups that are in some way opposing multiculturalism or opposing Aboriginal identity in one way or another. I mean, this is quite discouraging, but also very discouraging is the fact that there seems to be a very unchecked unchecked behavior, let's say unchecked response towards these elements or these extremist activities. We do not hear of a lot of follow-up on it, or we do not, I mean, probably the government is taking cognizance of it, but it is coming a bit too slow. I think Australia currently is under both domestic pressure and also diplomatic pressure as a result of what happened with Mahatma Gandhi's statue. And I mean, let's not forget, Mahatma Gandhi is no longer one of those icons that represents only an independence movement, right? He represents so much more, including his ideas of peace, non-violence, including now that he is an Indian icon in a way, which the Indian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has very actively over decades. They've sent busts or statues of Mahatma Gandhi to several countries to establish a good, healthy, friendly relationship with all of these, partners that India is making across the world. So having Mahatma Gandhi's statue targeted globally or targeted in Australia cannot just be seen as an act of people trying to sell off a metal for scrap value or something like that. It is more like a targeted attack on India's cultural asset or an act of cultural vandalism. I mean, was this statue in itself very, very important? I mean, it was a bronze statue, right? It was gifted by Indian Council for Cultural Relations to Australia. So it does hold a lot of symbolic and diplomatic value. But what's more important here is that we must understand that this is just one, as you mentioned, it is just one in a series of attacks, a series of vandalism-related incidents that have been occurring in Australia. And the response unfortunately from both sides is deeply distressing. I mean, India keeps raising alarm on these incidents, whether they are linked with Khalistan or not. And on the Australian side, they just seem to be multiplying in one way or another. So, I mean, I look at this as not a standalone incident. I look at this as, like you mentioned, generating some sort of a wider mood of fringe groups in the country who are trying to hijack the overall political environment in Australia. But overall, a very, very sorry state of affairs, given that now cultural assets and cultural identities are being targeted.
There is, of course, evidence that anti-India sentiment has been on the rise in the Western world. You've got it's on the rise in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Europe. How does this affect the Indian diaspora's sense of safety and belonging?
Absolutely. I mean, you said it spot on. It does impact, I would say, the confidence. It does impact, people's sense of cultural identity and being able to express that identity abroad. And this, I would say, this does not just hold true for the Indians. It does, it symbolizes a lot of anxiety amongst the diaspora and all of the international diaspora that exists anywhere else in the world. So, I mean, for me, it would be wonderful to hear from Australia, probably stricter rules, more surveillance. I mean, from what I hear about the investigations, which are still ongoing, they are looking at CCTV footages. They are trying to see who did it for what motive. But we would not know unless those things come out in the news. However, I mean, what I would also be very encouraged seeing is that if the community as a whole tries to maintain peace, not react to a lot of these incidents strongly, because remember, let's not forget, a lot of these identity-based attacks are usually meant to stir negative emotions. So as long as people can maintain their peace and calm and trust the authorities and, let the law take its course, I think that would be the best course of action. But it is definitely a lesson for, not just Australia, but also rest of the world, that there is a rise in extremist activity. There is a rise in, instrumentalization of these identity politics in favor of more violence and we need stricter laws. We definitely need way more surveillance and way more safety and assurance that needs to be provided to diaspora communities abroad.
Dr. Chadha, as always, it's a great pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much for taking the time in joining us here on the programme. We now move on to our next story and some news from the tech world. And a major PC manufacturers, including HP, Dell, Acer and Asus, are considering sourcing memory chips from Chinese chip makers such as Changxin Memory Technologies. This comes amid a global shortage of memory chips, which has caused disruptions in electronic supply chains and led to rising costs in the tech industry. HP is qualifying Chinese products and plans to monitor the situation until mid-2026. If the shortage continues and prices rise, it could begin sourcing from China for non-US markets. Dell and Acer are also looking at alternatives, eyeing Chinese DRAM products to manage supply risks in the coming years. Well, that's all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more international news updates.